When I think about things that need fixing in America, one of the things that comes to mind is the post office. Am I the only one in the room? Apparently I am. All right. Well, I'll just go ahead and tell my story as though everybody else agrees with me. And if you work for the post office, forgive me, right? Apparently you all work for the post office because you all think it's great. And I have to give you a bit of a background to this story before I tell it to you. It comes down to who I am. I'm going to give you a picture into who I am personally and some of my background. So genetically, I come from a Hungarian background. My grandfather was 100% Hungarian. And when I was a kid, my grandma was at the library and she ran across a book that she borrowed from there. And the title of the book made my grandpa really mad. The title of the book was, "If You Have a Hungarian for a Friend, You Don't Need an Enemy." Yeah, true. You can laugh. It's funny. We all thought it was hilarious because, and I've got a friend who's from Romania, what I've discovered is people from that part of the world just tell it like they see it, right? I mean, this is how it is. You just lay it out there and you let people deal with the consequences afterward. And so that was kind of the environment I grew up in, and the thing that I learned of you just share your opinion. You share what you think, right? So I'm going to share what I think. Because I went to the post office about a month ago and I had sold something on eBay. Now, it was junk that I was trying to get out of the house. Not junk, but it was a little remote control. But I sold it for 99 cents, okay? Like, there's no profit margin on this, right? So I sell it for 99 cents. I buy a shipping label. I wrap it up. I take it to the post office, and I give it to the very nice gentleman there who says to me, "I'm really sorry, but if you want to ship this, you're going to have to upgrade your service." And it wasn't because the envelope was too big. It wasn't because it weighed too much. It was because it was an old envelope I had received something in, and it happened to say priority on the side of it. And so because it said priority, I was not allowed to send it via the class of mail that I had sent. And I said to the guy, I'm like, "But I recycled, right? I mean, I didn't just take this envelope from the post office. I didn't just take, right? I mean, I'm recycling. This is a good thing. We're supposed to recycle here in America." And he's just like, "Yeah, I'm really sorry. It's not going to work." So needless to say, I was a little bit miffed with the whole thing, right? So I left, I found another envelope, I packaged it back up, put a new sticker on it. I mean, literally the same piece of mail with the exception of the outer wrapping being different. And I take it back to this guy who happens to be the same person who served me again. And he's like, "Thank you for changing out the envelope." Again, he was very polite. No criticism to him at all. But I looked at him and I said, "This is so dumb." I know, and I said, "I know it's not your fault. I know you're just doing your job and you're doing what you're supposed to do as a postal worker." But I said, "This is stupid, right? That this envelope is literally the same thing. So we should just fix the post office in America, and I think we'd all be good." And you're like, "Why is he telling that story?" It will all make sense here in just a minute, I promise. So we are in part 3 of our series, Fixing America. We've been talking about how we all know America's broken. It's not one side or the other. It is both sides working together. 70% of Americans think America's broken, that we need to fix something, but that is where the agreement ends, right? I mean, that's, we agree on the brokenness, but we can't agree on how to go about doing it, and that's where the problems start. We all come at it from a different point of view. But today, what I want to propose is that I think if we could kind of figure out this fix, this thing we're going to talk about today, I think if we could figure this out, that we as Christians particularly, and if you're here today and you're not a follower of Jesus, I'll just kind of let you in on what we Christians are supposed to be doing and how we're supposed to be living. But I think if we could figure this out, we would have the power to move our country in a different direction. But in order to do that, we would need to take off our political hats and be willing to say this very hard thing, that when my faith rubs up against my political point of view, my faith wins every time. That I'm not going to change my faith so that it matches what our politicians are saying or what the party that, I'm most likely to vote for is saying. But I'm going to allow my faith to dictate where my politics go. I'm going to be a Jesus follower before I am a party line follower. Or here's another way of saying it, that my faith matters more than my politics. And I say this, and I've said this every week in this series, so if you're new, I just want you to know this. I don't come at this as somebody who doesn't have an opinion, a political opinion. I have all kinds of political opinions. Sit down, let's chat about it, right? I mean, just not here from the stage, because this isn't the place for me to share my opinions. I have points of view. I think you should have a point of view. I think you should vote for a candidate, and I hope you do vote for a candidate. I hope you use your rights as an American to vote your conscience and vote for whoever it is that you think will do the best job fulfilling office. But I also hope you won't put your faith or your hope in a flawed political candidate. Because whoever you vote for is flawed. I promise you. Last couple of presidential elections particularly, it was just fascinating to sit and talk with people on both sides of the political aisle. Sometimes I'd hear people say, well, I can't vote for Donald Trump because this, that, and the other, so I'm going to cast my vote for Joe Biden or Hillary Clinton. And then I look at them and be like, yeah, but what about this corruption or this thing that they've done or, their association? I mean, come on, or I'd sit down with someone else. Well, I can't vote for Hillary because of this, or I can't vote for Joe Biden because of that. I'm like, yeah, but look at Donald Trump. I mean, he's not exactly a spitting image of like a holy person, right? I mean, there's some broken things there. And my point is that all political candidates are flawed. Every last one of them. Just like you and me are flawed. Just like we're flawed. That's what we talked about the very first week of the series. We talked about how we're all broken. We all have a heart problem, which is why we all need Jesus. And in an election, you have a few options of flawed political candidates. So pray about it, vote your conscience, do the right thing, but don't put your hope there. Unless, of course, Jesus is running for office, in which case, you'd be a fool not to vote for him, right? But I don't think that's going to happen. So just know that your candidate is flawed. They're just coming at the problems from a different point of view. They're coming at it from a different point of view. And the thing that we said the first week of our series is that your point of view is less important than the you next to you. The you that you go to work with or your kids go to school with. I mean, the people, right? Being civil with one another matters more. It is more important than getting your political agenda passed. Loving the people around us matters far more than accomplishing what it is that we think the government should accomplish. But that's hard to do, particularly if you grew up in an environment like I grew up on, where we have an opinion, right? We have strong feelings. We have strong thoughts. We're taught that our point of view matters and it's right, and you should affirm my point of view and you should see things from my side. And the reason why, this matters is we need to fix things to go the direction we think they should go. And it becomes about fixing other people's points of view. We want to fix other people's points of view. We want them to vote how we vote, raise their kids how we think they should raise their kids, pay the taxes we think they should pay, and move people the direction that we want them to move in. But whenever we use this word fix right here, it implies that something's broken, doesn't it? I mean, you use the word fix when something is broken and it needs to be repaired. And it's kind of like the old adage, if you're a hammer, the world is your nail, right? I mean, that's kind of how it works. And one of the problems with fixing problems is problems become all you see. When we're so focused on fixing things, we just see all the negative. We just see all the brokenness, and it just becomes this self-fulfilling prophecy. We will inevitably find problems if we are looking for problems. And the problem with looking for problems is we just fixate on fixing. And that's all we're thinking about. And as I said, throughout this series, this is kind of just my personal confession here. This is one of the hardest things for me, whether it's because of my genetics or my upbringing or, the church environment I grew up in, I don't know, or maybe a mix of all of that. But it cannot become an excuse because we get so focused on our point of view that we miss that there are other people who have a different point of view, and that is actually okay. We should not become fixated on fixing over the person who matters. Now, that's kind of how I fix. I just say what's right and wrong, and I can point it out, and I'm very good at that. That's how I fix. The question is, how do you fix things? How do you fix problems in your life? Whether it's a relationship, or whether there's a conflict with a spouse or kids or your parents, right? Or at the post office or at a store. And I'm not proud of that whole interaction, right? Just being honest, right? Be honest with you. How do you fix the problems in the country? I mean, right? When you see that there should be a different way of handling things, how do you handle that? Are you just bold and you say it like it is and you tell people what they need to hear and you lay down the truth and you drop your truth bomb? Do you take to social media? You put the bumper sticker on the car or the signs out in front of the house, or do you block people, right? And it's like, I can't hear you. I only want to hear my own point of view. Like if you offend me, you're upsetting my personal peaceful space, right? I mean, how do you do it? And the question is how you're doing it actually working, right? See, when we focus on fixing, we become known, stick this up here, we become known for what we're against rather than what we're for. And one of the problems in our country right now is actually a Christianity image problem. And that there are people fleeing from Christianity. And one of the reasons that they give is that they're being treated as problems to be fixed rather than people to be loved. I grew up in church. I grew up in a very probably conservative church environment. And, I was kind of, I don't even know if it was expressly stated. It was just kind of understood. Maybe it's just understood, right? That there are certain things that we're supposed to be against. We're supposed to be against Disney and the LGBT community. We're supposed to be against Democrats and alcohol. And we're supposed to be against smoking and cussing and, premarital sex. And we're supposed to be against Starbucks and their Christmas cups. And we're supposed to be against, stores that don't say Merry Christmas at the Christmas time, right? And we're supposed to be against all those things. But rather than being against things, or rather than being for things, we just stood against them. And it didn't change our country for the better. 20 years later, things are not better in this country. I think we could all agree that the mission of Christians, like the culture warrior Christians, it hasn't moved things in a different direction. And so we've got to think differently about this. And so if that's you, if you kind of grew up in that context and that idea that, we're supposed to fix all the people around us and fix the world around us, we've got some hard things to learn today. If you were on the receiving end of that and somebody tried to fix you, I just want to say how sorry I am, and I'll take responsibility because I'm sure there are people who felt that I tried to fix them. And it was all because I thought I was being bold, right? And we're kind of told this is the cross you bear. You're bold, right? And people may not like you because of it. But I think we misunderstood something very important that Jesus was inviting us to, because it wasn't being bold in casting judgment. It wasn't being bold in fixing other people. It was a different kind of boldness that he invited us to. And the problem with being bold at casting judgment is that Jesus never looked at people as problems to be fixed. People were not problems in Jesus' eyes. People were people to be loved. And there were times when Jesus said harsh things, but it was always in the context of, I care deeply for you. I love you. You're headed down a path that is going to lead to destruction in your life. I have something better for you. It was always couched in the context of, I care so deeply for you. It was never in the judgmental, condemning, point your finger at point of view. In fact, one of the things that we Americans, when we think about God, and the word that kind of comes to our mind when we think about God, if you grew up in this country, you're going to know what I'm talking about, is something that Jesus, one of his closest disciples, recognized. John, he wrote this incredible thing because he said, Jesus came in the fullness of grace and truth. He wasn't afraid to say hard things, but he always couched it with, God cares so much about you. I care so much about you. You're killing yourself. Go this way. It is a better way. I want to lead you in a different path. But it was never condemning. In fact, the word that John used to describe Jesus, it was this. He said, God is love. God is love. Now, this comes from John, who is part of Jesus' inner circle. This was written in one of the letters. John wrote 3 different letters that are recorded for us in the New Testament. He also wrote one of the Gospels, or the accounts of Jesus' life. But it's in this letter, toward the end of his life, John is kind of reflecting on the person of Jesus. He's reflecting on what he knew. John was given the responsibility of caring for Jesus' mother after Jesus was crucified. So, that tells you the closeness of their relationship. And so after spending all this time with Jesus, after watching him interact with people, after looking at him eyeball to eyeball, after sharing meals with him, countless meals, listening to his teaching, John's conclusion is, you know what God is? God is love. God is love. And that whole concept permeates the New Testament. You cannot read through the New Testament, the accounts of Jesus' life and beyond, without understanding that God is love. Every once in a while, people come to me and they're like, Seth, why do you talk so much about love? Why don't you talk more about judgment, right? Well, it's because Jesus, when he gave this command at the end of his life, he didn't say, judge others as I've judged you, right? Jesus didn't give the command to judge and condemn one another and hold grudges and boycott and cancel people who don't see things the way you see them. He told people to love one another as I have loved you. And how did Jesus love us? He gave his life. He sacrificed himself. He gave himself up in our worst possible state. He said, I want you to come follow me. And when you begin reading the New Testament through that filter of God is love and fulfilling that command that Jesus gave to love one another as he's loved us, man, it all starts to make sense. It all begins to click. And you begin to understand what Jesus taught, that kindness, and the Apostle Paul said this, he said it's God's kindness that leads us to repentance or a change in our lives. It's God's kindness that moves us in a different way. It's not judgment. Zacchaeus, you probably know Zacchaeus. He was a wee little man, and a wee little man was he, and he climbed up in the sycamore tree for the Lord he wanted to see, and as the Savior passed his way, he looked up in the tree and said, Zacchaeus, you come down, for I'm condemning you today, right? No, I'm coming to your house like Zacchaeus. I want to spend time with you. The world was condemning Zacchaeus, and Jesus said, I want to have a meal with you. I don't care if I get tax collecting cooties in your house, right? I mean, I'm going to come and I'm going to eat with you. And it changed Zacchaeus' life. We know that story, especially if you grew up in church. You even know the song, right? You could have sung it. Some of you were singing it with me. We know the song, but when it comes to living it out, I mean, we just have this idea in our minds of, oh no, we need to be culture warriors. Oh no, we need to condemn and judge and point our fingers. And yet we know Jesus lived so much differently. He brought light into darkness. Condemning, pointing fingers is bringing darkness to try and get rid of darkness. Now, some of you may be tempted to say, Seth, this sounds like a nice self-help message from a church that's too afraid to be bold. I guess I would ask the question, how does pointing a finger of judgment extinguish darkness in other people? Has it ever motivated you to change? No. Which is why Jesus invited us into a different way. But don't take my word for it. Take John's word for it. In fact, here's what he said. We're going to pick this up, 1 John chapter 1. Now, we're not going to go through all of 1 John, but I'd encourage you to spend some time reading it this afternoon. It is a phenomenal letter, and it is challenging, okay? Here's what he said. He says, this is the message we have heard from him being Jesus, and we declare to you, God is light. Not the light or a light, but it's his nature, that God is light, and wherever light goes, this light illuminates darkness. The goodness of God illuminates the darkness and the evil around. He goes on, he says, God is light, and in him there is no darkness at all, because darkness and light, they can't coexist. Light necessarily illuminates the darkness. God's presence illuminates darkness. So then he goes on and he kind of explains what he's trying to say. He goes on, he says this, he says, if we claim to have fellowship with him and yet walk in the darkness. So we claim to have this relationship with God, he says, but if we walk in the darkness, this is uncomfortable and this is a little confrontational. He says, we lie and we don't live out the truth. Like if we're claiming to be followers of Jesus, but we're living in a way that just spreads darkness around, then we are missing something very important. We are deceiving ourselves. Now, my guess is for you and me, most of us in the room, maybe all of us in the room, we've all had a moment in time where in church we call it conviction, right? I mean, conviction. You're living your life a certain way, and then something kind of starts working on the inside of you, or maybe pinging your conscience a little bit, and you think, man, I can't continue doing this and follow Jesus. I can't continue living with her and following Jesus, right? I mean, we need to, if we're not married, we got to separate or we move out, right? Or I can't continue looking at that stuff and following Jesus. I can't continue treating people in such a reprehensible way and following Jesus. I can't continue, being so impatient with everyone and follow Jesus, right? And whether it was from a sermon or maybe it was camp. I love camp. When I was a youth pastor, we loved cry night at the end of camp because everybody's tired and emotional, right? And they're feeling the conviction, right? So they all start crying. It's like, oh, I know what I've been doing. I know what my parents, my relationship with my parents. And so I'm going to throw my stick in the fire as my representative of things are going to be different. Things are going to change, right? And what I would call those are hinge moments in our lives. They're the moments in time where we say, I can't continue in this direction and follow God. I have to move in a different way. Things have to change. And the implication that John is saying is that we actually have to move in a different direction. We can't just say God's working in me and not move. right? It can't just be like a cry night decision and then I go back to my friends who were they haven't changed at all and I'm just back into the same old stuff. Or it can't be a Sunday morning decision based on what happened Saturday night and the guilt I was feeling. And so, I'm going to make a change here for just a minute. Like this has to be an ongoing, when John says walking in the light, it means an ongoing process of moving in the direction of Jesus. It's not a perfection, don't misunderstand me, but it's a direction. I can't go back to the darkness because light is calling me, and darkness is extinguished by light. He goes on, here's what he says. He says, but if we walk in the light as he is in the light, we have fellowship with one another. Now that's kind of weird, isn't it? I mean, wouldn't you expect him to say, okay, if I'm moving toward the light and I'm allowing God to illuminate this stuff in my life, I have a fellowship, that just means like a connection, relationship with God. I mean, wouldn't you think that'd be the case? But what John is explaining is the very thing that Jesus said in his command. The Jewish people, they understood, okay, I'm supposed to love the Lord my God with all my heart, mind, and strength, and I'm supposed to love my neighbor as myself. But when Jesus brought those things together, he said, look, you can't love the Lord your God without loving your neighbor. You can't, because you're walking in the light, and it's necessarily going to bring light to all of your relationships. It's going to bring light into your relationship with your neighbor. It's going to bring light into the relationship with the person at the post office. Right? It's going to bring light into the relationship with the teachers at your kid's school, with the politicians in your community, whoever. I mean, it's going to bring light there. So what John is saying is that we have a responsibility that when we walk in the light, things will change in our relationships with other people. There will be healing, there will be restoration. He goes on, he says, and the blood of Jesus, his son, purifies us from all sin. We're forgiven. There is a movement forward. There is a movement forward, and it is a painful process, let me tell you, of allowing God to illuminate the dark areas of our lives. Allowing the darkness in your life to be overcome by light is both wonderful and painful at the same time. Because it requires a death to yourself. And it requires a death to your way of interacting with people. It requires a death to your point of view that you and I were told matters so much, so that we can elevate other people, so that we can look to their needs, so that we can love others the way that Christ loved us. John continues on. He says, dear friends, I'm not writing you a new command. Like, this isn't a new thing, but an old one. You've heard this. This isn't new, which you've had since the beginning, right? From the beginning of time. So from the beginning of Jesus, right? He took all these things. He says, this old command is the message you have heard. Then he says something a little confusing. He goes on, he says, but yet I'm writing you a new command, right? The old command about love the Lord your God that we were just talking about, how Jesus intertwined those things. Like, this is new. It is new and it is different and it is challenging that you can't love God without loving your neighbor as yourself. And in the process of loving your neighbor as yourself, you'll be loving God. Then I want you to love others as I have loved you. And John knew that firsthand because he saw it firsthand. He saw the way Jesus loved people like Matthew. Matthew, that disgusting tax gatherer who cheated his own people. Jesus invited himself over to Matthew's house to have dinner with his tax-collecting friends, and he wasn't concerned about getting tax-collecting cooties. He wasn't concerned about being unclean ceremonially. He just loved Matthew. It's like, I saw the way Jesus loved Matthew. He saw the way Jesus loved him and his brother James when they wanted to call down, nuclear weapons from heaven on the people of Samaria that we talked about last week. Yet Jesus still knelt down and washed his feet. Jesus knelt down. Don't miss this. This is so significant. We breeze past this stuff sometimes. Jesus knelt down and washed the feet of Judas, the one who would betray him in just a few hours for a measly bag of coins. Jesus knelt down and washed his feet. He says, I want you to love others the way I loved Judas, the way I loved Matthew, the way I loved every one of those 12 disciples who left my side when I needed them most. That's how you love. He goes on, he says, I'm writing you a new command. Its truth is seen in him, in Jesus, and in you, because the darkness is passing and the true light is already shining. There is a new era that we are invited into to be conveyors of that love to one another as we minister to each other and love as he has loved us. And you know the test for us This is it. Here's what he says, verse 9. He says, anyone who claims to be in the light, but, here it is, there's a big blank there. I don't just want you to think about this. Anyone who claims to be in the light but votes for a Republican is still in the darkness. I mean, can you imagine John saying that? Yeah. Anybody who claims to be in the light but votes for a Democrat, is still in the darkness. I mean, wouldn't you expect John to say anybody who claims to be in the light but worships Satan is still in darkness? I mean, isn't that what you would think he would say? But you know what he says? This is huge. Don't miss this. This is huge. He says, anyone who claims to be in the light but hates a brother or sister. What? Of all the things you could have put in there, John, you're going to say hate? Like, yeah, that's the opposite of love. It means to spit on someone in your heart. It means to dislike someone so extremely, to hold hostility against someone. Or here's the definition. It's an attitude of anger that has become a habit. It's not a one-time sort of thing flying off the handle, but it's a way of being that devalues other people. It's how you respond to the world around you, how you respond to politicians, how you respond to post office workers, how you respond to people at the grocery store, how you respond to the schools and CRT or whatever, how you respond to drivers who cut you off. You're just angry. John says we cannot live in the light and hate other people. We can't. We are called to be gracious to those who are ungracious. We are called to forgive those who won't forgive us. We are called to be kind even when people are unkind. We are called to be generous even when people want to take advantage of us. We're called to be patient when people aren't patient back. John would say love is only a genuine value when we have to love someone who is unlovable. It's not hard to love people who like us, who treat us nicely, who, free upsize us at the store. I mean, it's not easy to love the people who are gracious to us, but to love those who have hurt us, who have hurt the people we care about, who have offended us, who see things from a different point of view. I mean, that's where it's actually a challenge. That's where we have to put into practice something that we don't like to practice. To love the unlovable and to love the unlovely is difficult. That's why it's so hard. And yet it's exactly what Jesus modeled. When he was dying on the cross, to the crowd who had shouted, "Crucify him, crucify him, crucify him," hours before, he's crying out to his Father in heaven saying, "Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing." Wow. That's love. That's a Jesus-defined love. It's different than our own definition of love, the sappy love that we talk about in our culture. He goes on, he says, anyone who loves their brother and sister lives in the light, and there is nothing in them to make them stumble. And when he talks about this, he's saying, look, when you and I live that out, when people see us living that out, we don't get in the way of other people following Jesus. We don't cause other people to stumble. Let me explain that a little bit, because it could be that there are people in your life who don't believe what you believe, who don't understand what you understand. And I mean, hey, you may be here today and you're just kind of exploring it all too. And you're trying to figure out faith. But the thing is that when genuine followers of Jesus live in such a way that we are fulfilling this command, we don't cause other people to, be angry at the church, be angry at Christianity, want nothing to do with us. It leads them to be a little bit curious and say, man, they're weird people, but they're sure kind people. Man, they are so nice. I'd love to, we've talked about this, I'd love my daughter to date one of those, or I'd love my son to date one of those Christians, right? I'd love for a Christian to work for me because they're just great people. They're just great people. See, love makes a way. Love illuminates the way. And they may find it hard to believe what you believe, but they will be inspired to follow Jesus because there's just something different. There's something attractive. It changed the world 2,000 years ago. It did. In spite of politics, in spite of the Roman Empire, Christianity, love changed the world. Jesus defined love. It requires us, stick this up here, to put others before ourselves, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it costs us, which is what Jesus did on the cross for us. That's the invitation. John kind of finished up by saying this, and this particular text. He says, but anyone who hates a brother or sister is in the darkness and walks around in the darkness. They do not know where they are going because the darkness has blinded them. But when you live in the light gets brighter and brighter and brighter. When you live in the dark, it just gets darker and darker and darker. When you claim to live in the light, but you live in darkness, you become a stumbling block to other people. And that's kind of where we are as a country. People don't want anything to do with Christians because we haven't been living in the light. We become culture warriors at the expense of what matters most. The command that Jesus gave us to love one another as he's loved us. I'm telling you, when we get this, loving the way Jesus loved us, it illuminates the world around us. And we can help people come out of the dark. And quite honestly, the darker the world gets, the brighter the light shines. You've ever had those moments where you're walking around in the dark at home and your eyes are adjusted to the dark, you're kind of stumbling around, but then you flip a light on by accident, and it's like, whoa, right? I mean, it's like, oh, I can't even see. I mean, that's what we're called to do as Christians. That's what we're called to be as Christians. And the darkness it cannot overcome the light because light extinguishes darkness. So I want to give you a bit of homework today, and I'll warn you up front, this is a hard bit of homework, okay? As if this series has been like a happy-go-lucky series. I know, but hopefully it's been thought-provoking, and hopefully it's made you think about things in a different way. And let me just say this, if there's anything here you're like, oh, I don't agree with that, go search it out on your own. Let's sit down and have coffee. We'll talk about it, right? I'd love to hear where you're coming from, and I'd love to understand. But this is an important question, not for you to ask yourself. And here's the reason why, because we're good at lying to ourselves, aren't we? Like, you're your best salesman in the world. You could sell yourself anything, right? I mean, you can make justification and explanation, but what I want you to do is I want you to take this question and have somebody else answer it for you. Have a trusted friend or an advisor, a parent or a spouse, right? I mean, somebody who really cares about you, and as much as you may be tempted to shut them down and not think about it, I just want to invite you to really process through this and really think about it. Okay, you ready for the question? Here it is. Does my life reflect the light of Christ? Really? You could add really onto that. Does my life reflect the light of Christ? Really? And then just be quiet and listen. Maybe you ask a clarifying question, but don't make any statements. Just ask questions and try to understand. And you might be offended, you might be hurt. I said it's painful, but the point is that we can't move forward if we don't understand, right? Does my life reflect the light of Christ? Figure out how you can grow, and then ask this important follow-up question: how can I better reflect the light of Christ? And listen to their response, and ask follow-up questions. And then you just take it before God and say, God, I want to be light. I want to love the way you've loved me. I want to illuminate the world around me. Help me to live this out in a different way. I know this is super cliche, right? Back in the 90s, there were these WWJD bracelets. Anybody remember those? What would Jesus do? They've kind of made a comeback. I feel like I've seen them recently on people. But I know it's so cliche, but honestly, I mean, just ask yourself, could you see Jesus responding to that post office worker the way you just responded to them? I mean, can you see Jesus responding in that relationship or to that politician? Or can you see Jesus taking to social media the way you just took to social media? Could you see Jesus putting that bumper sticker on his camel, right? I mean, come on. Could you see him doing that? Or putting that sign in front of his little hut? I mean, could you see Jesus doing any of those things? And if you can't imagine Jesus doing it, then we shouldn't be doing it. That's not how he brought light into the world. He was so different. And ask yourself, how would Jesus treat that person? In light of their current situation, in light of their political persuasion, in light of their life choices, I mean, how would Jesus interact with them? And don't forget that Jesus' harshest words were to the religious people. And I hate to break it to you, you're in a religious service right now. You are at church, right? So, I mean, it kind of applies to you. So how would Jesus treat people who were nothing like him? People who were nothing like Jesus, and he liked them back. And that's what we should be. That's light. And it made the world brighter 2,000 years ago. And I think it can make the world brighter today. But we have to start doing it. We have to start doing it. John said this, last thing. He says, "Dear children, let us not love with words or speech, but in," what's this word? Actions and in truth. Let's live it out. Let's do what he's called us to do. We don't just have an opportunity, my friends, we have an obligation if we call ourselves followers of Christ. Now, if you're here again and you're not a follower of Christ yet, maybe something's kind of clicked with you and you're starting to understand that. Man, there's no better day than today. There's no better time than now to make a decision and say, I want to choose to follow Jesus. And if that's you, come talk to me after the service. I would love to tell you more about that and what it means. Or come talk to John or one of us on staff. But I hope this week you'll have the courage to ask somebody to help you answer those very difficult questions. Does my life reflect the light of Christ? And how can I better reflect the light of Christ? And maybe if we can begin doing this, our dark world will become much, much brighter. Let me pray for us. Heavenly Father, this is hard stuff to talk about. It is, because it's confrontational, and there are times when, we have our excuses of why we want to treat people the way we think they should be treated, why our point of view is the right point of view and all that stuff. But Father, I just pray that you would give us all a spirit of humility, the way that Jesus had humility, that you would give us courage to ask those important questions and to wrestle with the answers. And to not just push them aside, but to take them to you. And Father, would you use us to bring light into our communities? Would you help us to live out that command to love one another as you have loved us through Jesus? Would you help us to be light in dark? Father, would you give each one of us the wisdom we need to know what we need to do, and then give us the courage to do it? And as a result, would we not be a stumbling block, but would we be a place of invitation that people would come to know you? The only hope that we have. I pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.